His hands were covered in blood as he carefully wrapped a bandage around the wing of a dying golden eagle, her wild eyes watching him with a mixture of terror and exhaustion. And he had no idea that 6 months later this same bird would come screaming down from the sky with her talons fully extended in a violent, explosive attack that would leave grown men running for their lives. But here's what makes this story unforgettable. The attack happened so fast and so ferociously that even the armed men standing over him didn't have time to react, and what happened in those final seconds will make you question everything you ever believed about wild animals and whether they truly forget the people who showed them mercy. So ask yourself this before we go any further: if you saved a creature that could kill you with a single strike, would it ever remember your kindness, or would it simply return to the wild and forget you ever existed? Because his name was Thomas Reed, and he lived alone in a weathered cabin at the edge of the Cascade Mountains in Washington state, the kind of place where the nearest neighbor was 11 miles away and cell phone signals went to die. And if you saw Thomas on any given morning, you'd see a man in his late 50s with gray creeping into his beard and a quietness in his eyes that told you he'd seen things most people only read about. Because Thomas had spent 22 years as an army ranger before the world chewed him up and spit him out into this silence. And then 3 years ago, his wife Ellen passed away from cancer, and whatever light was left inside him seemed to flicker out with her final breath, leaving behind a man who chopped wood because it gave his hand something to do and walked the mountain trails because standing still felt like drowning. And so Thomas lived day after day in this rhythm of survival without purpose, heating canned soup on a propane stove and talking to no one except the wind that rattled through the pine trees, never expecting that one brutal October storm would change his entire life, because the storm came down from the mountains like something angry, snapping branches and flooding the creek that ran behind his property. And when the rain finally stopped 2 days later, Thomas walked out to check for damage, and that's when he saw her, a golden eagle lying crumpled at the base of an old Douglas fir, her massive wings twisted beneath her body and a deep gash running across her chest that was still oozing blood. And his first instinct was to back away, because a wounded eagle is one of the most dangerous creatures you can approach, capable of crushing bone with talons designed to kill. But something made him stop and look closer, and he realized she wasn't fighting anymore, her breathing shallow and her eyes half closed. And Thomas stood there for a long moment weighing the risks before he whispered to himself, "I can't just leave you here to die." So he walked back to the cabin, grabbed a thick blanket and his old leather-work gloves, and returned to face a creature that could blind him with a single strike if she decided he was a threat. And approaching her was terrifying, because even in her weakened state, she tried to lift her head and open her beak in warning. And Thomas moved slowly, speaking in a low, steady voice the way he used to calm panicked soldiers in combat zones, telling her that he wasn't going to hurt her even though he knew she couldn't understand the words. And when he finally got close enough to drape the blanket over her body, she made one weak attempt to bite him before collapsing back against the wet leaves. And that's when Thomas carefully wrapped her up and lifted her into his arms, shocked by how light she felt despite her massive wingspan. And he carried her back to the cabin with his heart pounding, because he had absolutely no idea what he was doing, only that walking away wasn't something his soul could survive. So he set up a makeshift recovery area in his woodshed using old blankets and a plastic tub filled with straw. And then came the hard part, cleaning the wound, because the gash across her chest was deep and already showing signs of infection. And Thomas used warm water, antiseptic from his first aid kit, and steady hands that somehow didn't shake despite the eagle watching his every movement, her golden eyes locked onto him like she was memorizing his face. And for the first few days she refused to eat anything he offered, turning away from the raw fish and strips of rabbit meat he placed near her beak. And Thomas started to wonder if she'd simply given up. But then on the 4th morning he walked into the shed and found her tearing into a piece of trout, and he felt something shift inside his chest, a tiny crack in the wall he'd built around his heart since Ellen died. And the days that followed became a strange kind of routine where Thomas would wake before dawn, check on the eagle, change her bandages, and sit with her for hours talking about things he hadn't spoken aloud in years, about Ellen, about the men he lost overseas, about the guilt he carried for surviving when so many others didn't. And the eagle would simply watch him with those intense golden eyes, never moving, never looking away, as if she understood that this broken man needed someone to listen even if that someone couldn't respond. And Thomas started calling her Athena, after the goddess of wisdom, because there was something ancient and knowing in the way she observed him, something that made him feel less alone for the first time since he buried his wife. And slowly, day by day, the wound began to heal, and Athena began to trust him enough to eat from his hand without trying to bite his fingers off. And there was one moment Thomas would never forget, and it happened about 3 weeks into her recovery when he was sitting on an overturned bucket watching her stretch her wings for the first time, testing their strength against the shed's dim light. And she stopped mid-stretch and turned her head to look directly at him, and for several seconds neither of them moved, their eyes locked in a silent exchange that felt impossibly heavy with meaning. And Thomas felt his throat tighten because he suddenly understood that this connection was real, that somehow against all logic he and this wild creature had formed a bond that transcended the boundaries between species, and he whispered, "You're going to be okay, girl." And he could have sworn her eyes softened just slightly before she folded her wings, and returned to watching him in that quiet, ancient way. And by the 6th week, Athena was fully healed and growing restless, pacing the shed and spreading her wings with an urgency that told Thomas exactly what needed to happen. So on a clear November morning when the sky was sharp blue and the air smelled like pine and freedom, Thomas opened the shed door wide and stepped back, and Athena walked slowly toward the opening, her head tilting as she took in the vast sky stretching endlessly above the tree line, and she stood there for what felt like forever, and Thomas felt his chest ache because he knew this was goodbye, knew that wild things belong to the wild no matter how much you loved them. And then she spread those magnificent wings, caught the wind, and lifted into the air with a power that stole his breath, circling once, twice, 3 times above the cabin before climbing higher and higher until she became nothing more than a dark speck against the clouds. And just before she disappeared completely, Thomas could have sworn she looked back at him one final time, and then she was gone, and he stood there alone in the cold morning air, surprised by the tears running down his face, surprised that saving something had made him feel more alive than he'd felt in years, and life returned to its quiet rhythms after that, chopping wood and walking trails and heating soup on the stove. But something had changed in Thomas. There was a small flame burning in his chest now, a reminder that kindness still mattered even when the world felt empty. And as winter settled over the mountains, he found himself looking up at the sky more often, scanning the tree line not because he expected to see Athena but because remembering her made him feel connected to something larger than his grief, and that connection sustained him through the dark December nights and the January snowstorms that buried his cabin to the window sills. But what Thomas didn't notice, couldn't have noticed, was that he'd attracted attention from a different kind of predator entirely, and it started with small things: tire tracks on the dirt road where no one should have been driving, a glimpse of men through the trees who vanished before he could get a good look, the feeling of being watched that prickled the back of his neck when he hiked the familiar trails, and Thomas told himself it was nothing, probably just hunters passing through or teenagers looking for a place to party. But deep in his gut, in that place where instinct lives, he knew something was wrong, and his military training started whispering warnings he couldn't ignore. So he began keeping his rifle closer and locking his doors at night, which he'd never bothered to do before, and the tension built slowly like water rising behind a dam, an unease that grew heavier with each passing day until even the silence of the forest felt threatening. And the night everything changed started with a sound that didn't belong, an engine cutting through the darkness, followed by voices too close to his cabin, and Thomas grabbed his rifle and moved to the window just in time to see 4 men emerging from a black truck, 2 of them carrying weapons, and his blood went cold because these weren't lost hikers or confused hunters, these were men who'd come looking for something. And when one of them pointed directly at his cabin and said, "That's the one," Thomas understood with terrible clarity that he was the target, probably because of the rumor he'd heard months ago about drug traffickers using these mountains as a transport route, and the man who'd gone to the sheriff with information that got ignored, and he'd thought nothing would come of it, thought they'd never trace that report back to the isolated cabin of a retired ranger. But he was wrong, and now 4 armed men were walking toward his door in the middle of the night with intentions that made his stomach turn to ice, and Thomas didn't have time to think, only to react. So he went out the back door and into the forest, moving through the darkness with skills he'd hoped never to use again. But they had flashlights and numbers and youth on their side, and within minutes he heard them crashing through the trees behind him, shouting to each other, spreading out to cut off his escape routes. And Thomas ran until his lungs burned, ran until a tree root caught his foot and sent him sprawling down a rocky slope, his rifle flying from his hands and disappearing into the brush, and he lay there in the dirt tasting blood from a split lip, his ankle screaming with pain, listening to the footsteps getting closer and knowing with cold certainty that this was how it ended, alone on a mountainside with no one to help him and no way to fight back. And when the flashlight beam found him and the 4 men formed a circle around his broken body, the leader smiled with teeth that gleamed in the darkness and said, "Thought you could hide from us, old man," and the first kick caught him in the ribs, and Thomas curled into himself as the blows rained down, each impact driving the air from his lungs and pushing him closer to unconsciousness. And through the haze of pain he heard them laughing, heard them discussing what to do with his body after they were finished, and he thought about Ellen waiting for him somewhere beyond this darkness, thought that maybe dying wouldn't be so bad if it meant seeing her again, and he was ready to let go, ready to stop fighting, when a sound split the night air that made every man freeze, a piercing shriek from somewhere above them, primal and furious and unmistakably the cry of a hunting raptor, and she came down like a missile from the heavens, talons extended and wings folded back for maximum speed, and Athena struck the leader's face with such force that he screamed and fell backward, blood pouring from deep gashes across his forehead and cheeks, and the other men had barely processed what was happening when she was airborne again, circling for another attack, her massive wingspan blocking out the stars as she dove at a second man who flew through his arms up too late to stop her talons from raking his scalp, and the mountain erupted into chaos as grown men who had come to kill suddenly found themselves fleeing in terror from a fury they couldn't shoot, couldn't stop, couldn't even see clearly in the darkness, and Athena was relentless, diving and striking and screaming that terrible cry that echoed off the trees like the voice of the wilderness itself defending one of its own, and Thomas pushed himself up despite the pain, his injured ankle barely holding his weight, and he watched in disbelief as the fourth man tripped over his own feet trying to escape and tumbled down the slope, his flashlight spinning away into the darkness, and within 90 seconds of her first attack, all 4 men were either running blindly through the forest or lying on the ground clutching bleeding wounds and begging for mercy, and the eagle circled overhead one final time before landing on a boulder 10 feet from where Thomas stood swaying in the darkness, and there in the faint moonlight he saw her, Athena, her chest still bearing the faintest scar from the wound he'd healed 6 months ago, her golden eyes fixed on him with that same ancient intensity he remembered from the shed, and neither of them moved, man and eagle regarding each other across the cold night air, and Thomas felt tears streaming down his face as the realization washed over him. She remembered, she came back, and in the moment when he needed her most, she chose to fight for him the way he had fought for her life all those months ago, and there were no words for this, no explanation that made logical sense, only the profound and undeniable truth that some bonds transcend what we think we know about the boundaries between wild and tame, between human and animal, between giving and receiving, and Thomas whispered through his tears, "Thank you, girl," and Athena tilted her head slightly, just slightly, before spreading those magnificent wings and lifting once more into the night sky, climbing until she disappeared among the stars, leaving Thomas alone on the mountainside but no longer feeling alone at all, and the authorities found the men easily enough after Thomas limped home and made the call, and he never told anyone the full truth about what happened that night because who would believe him, but he knew, and that was enough, and in the months that followed he found himself walking the trails with a different kind of peace in his heart, scanning the sky not with hope but with gratitude, knowing that somewhere, up there she was soaring free, living the wild life she was born for, carrying within her the memory of a man who showed mercy when he didn't have to and received it back when he needed it most, and if you asked Thomas what the experience taught him, he'd probably be quiet for a long moment before saying that the world is more connected than we realize, that every act of kindness sends ripples outward in directions we can't predict, and that sometimes, when you least expect it, those ripples come back to save you, because even the wild remembers who showed it mercy. Comment loyalty if you believe kindness always comes back when you least expect it, and share this story with someone who believes animals never forget.